Welcome to How to Get on a Watchlist, the new podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. In each episode, we'll sit down with leading experts to discuss dangerous activities. From assassinations and airliner shootdowns through to kidnappings and coups, we'll examine each of these threats through the lenses of both the dangerous actors seeking to conduct these operations and the agencies around the world seeking to stop them.
In the interest of operational security, certain tactical details will be omitted from these discussions. However, the cases and threats which we discuss here are very real.
I'm Louis H. Besant, the founder and co-editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitica. I'm a researcher in the field of intelligence and espionage with a PhD in intelligence studies from Loughborough University. I'm an adjunct professor in intelligence at Sciences Po Paris, and in my day job, I provide geopolitical analysis and security-focused intelligence to private sector corporations.
My name is Colin Reed. I am a former U.S. intelligence professional now working in the private sector to bring geopolitical insights and risk analysis to business leaders.
So in today's episode, we're talking about how to rob a bank, and joining us for this is FX Reagan. The pseudonymous FX Reagan was a street police officer in a major metropolitan police department, a SWAT team member, and is a retired FBI agent. After his 33-year career in law enforcement, he served as VP and COO for security at two large companies. In addition to writing full-time, he's a licensed private investigator. Reagan's writing in 3 fiction series, including the Area 51 Project series, the Detective Kiki Diaz thriller series, and the CJ Hawk FBI thriller series. You can follow all of his work at fxreagan.com, and we'll put links to those in the show notes. So, FX, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to this one.
So that's a really interesting background, and especially to talk about the subject today, you know, how bank robberies happen. So the first question we always like to ask our guests is, how did you get into a line of work like that?
Very unusually. I don't tell everybody. I didn't used to tell everybody, especially when I was in law enforcement. But I started in college as a music major, which didn't really translate into law enforcement. And what really got me was keyboard. I couldn't master the keyboard. So I transitioned to political science, criminal justice, and from there I just had an interest in police work.
That's super interesting. I think there's some of the creative still in you with your writing projects now. So let's kick this off. I want to ask you, when we think of a bank robbery, we're imagining sort of the movies, we're imagining these gangs of robbers sort of wearing the president masks and emptying vaults. Is that the case? Is that how a typical bank robbery looks, or what is a typical bank robbery?
Unfortunately, that's not the way most of them look. But there are some. I mean, we can talk about the more esoteric ones because those are the fun ones and the ones you see in movies and TVs and all. But, really, most of them are single lone individuals, very unsophisticated. Many of them are not even armed, even if they claim they're armed. I'd say maybe even half who walk in and, write a note to the teller that says, this is a robbery. I have a gun. Give me all the money. But half of them really don't even have a gun. But, the teller has to go along with that. So for the most part, I'd say 75 to 80% are not sophisticated lone individuals, very often drug related.
So what about kind of reconnaissance and scoping out a target for these kind of gangs? Let's talk about those more sophisticated gangs. I'm assuming those kind of lower stakes drug related ones, they just go for what's closest, what they see at the time. But if we're thinking around a more sophisticated robbery, do they, are they doing reconnaissance on the bank beforehand? How does that kind of stuff work? How do they choose a target?
My experience would be that most of them that are gang related or that have more than one individual or even they're most sophisticated you can come up with are inside jobs. They're people that know something about the bank. They have a friend, a girlfriend, a spouse, a girlfriend usually that works in the bank. They used to work in a bank. They know somebody who works in a bank. And so a lot of them that are gang related or in any way related to having a sophisticated plot involve an inside job. Now, there are some, I'm sure, that they do some surveillance, that they're looking for a bank that is farther away from the police headquarters, that's close to a major interstate so they can make a fast getaway. But there's some of that. It's a minority of the number of banks that are robbed that way, but there are some.
So is there a story of the craziest or most sophisticated bank robbery you've seen in your time?
I would say the one that most related, the ones, I shouldn't say the one bank, but several bank robberies that took place in the late 80s, actually middle late 80s down in Miami, Florida, that unfortunately resulted in the death of 2 FBI agents and the wounding of 3 others. Those were 2 guys that were exactly what you're describing. These guys were serious badasses. They were armed to the teeth. They went in, guns blazing. They robbed numerous banks in South Florida before the FBI was onto them, and then tried to take them down on the way to rob another bank. That's a pretty famous story. There are books about it. One of the agents who was a real hero, well, they're all heroes, but one who valiantly fought while he was seriously wounded and ended up firing the fatal shots, even though the 2 robbers were shot many, many times, and that was part of the story. That one resonates. It resonates really for me, not only because I was an FBI agent, but when I was in the FBI Academy, Ed Morales, that's the agent who was seriously wounded and ended up finishing off the 2 bank robbers, was one of the instructors down there. Part-time, he came down basically to decompress. He was still a little bit wounded. He had very serious arm injuries and was rehabilitating. And as part of the FBI's efforts to get him kind of, back to a place where he could be an FBI agent again, he was sort of on sabbatical at the academy. And I got to hear that story full time from him. So that's a dramatic event that I'm aware of, although I didn't participate in it. Another one that sticks out in my mind is when I was a senior management official in a field office, and I believe it was 2 robbers. It might have been 3, but I think it was only 2. And their plot, really bold, was to grab a female bank manager as she came out of work and locked up the bank at, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening when the bank closed, took her home to her house, tied up her family in the basement, and waited overnight with the whole family to then take her back to the bank at opening time, because they knew that the way the vaults were set, that they didn't want to go in at 5 o'clock because the vault was already closed. They wanted to be in there at opening, when she got there, open to the bank for her and the employees, but before the customers could come in. And they successfully, took a significant amount of money, made a getaway, but then, we caught up to them, I would say, within 2 or 3 days. But that was the most sophisticated, sort of outrageous one I had a part in.
That's a scary situation involving the sort of hostage taking.
Correct.
Is that a common tactic that bank robbers will use? Are they often trying to take hostages and use that leverage? Or is that something that, in a lot of cases they try to avoid?
I think the latter. I think they try to avoid it, in and out as fast as they can, not get pinned down in a hostage situation.
Is that a deliberate choice to, I'm imagining a hostage situation, it becomes more complicated for the robbers to get away. I imagine it draws more law enforcement. What drives that kind of strategy?
So I think to avoid it, it's speed. They want in and out because they know that there's a certain amount of time. As soon as the alarms go off, and all the banks, it's not, any state secret that banks all have silent alarms that can be triggered by all the employees and that go directly to an alarm company, which notifies the police department. And many jurisdictions, I'm not sure the percentage, but some of them go right to a police switchboard. So they know they have a limited amount of time. And that if a hostage situation develops, it's usually because time got away from them or the police got there sooner than they thought. That happens. I'm aware of, I'm trying to think of exactly when it happened or which city I was assigned in. But, the police being right outside, the alarm goes off and they're right there. And now you have a hostage situation because they couldn't have anticipated that a police car would be right out front, just happenstance. But yeah, I think for the most part, they would 100% try to avoid that hostage situation. And when it happens, it's only because something went wrong. Except the one I described, where they took her home, kept her hostage overnight, and then brought her. So that's clearly one where they wanted it, but not inside the bank, and it was sort of secret. She couldn't call for help.
Earlier, you mentioned something about, a lot of these robberies, they don't even have a weapon. How does that work? How does a robber rob a bank without a weapon?
Because I think they know that the tellers are all trained to act like it's an armed robbery no matter what. So many of them don't even have a weapon. If they had money for a weapon, they'd have money for the small amount of drugs they want to buy with the proceeds of the bank robbery for some of them. But I think some of them they think they're being tactical, that by saying they have a weapon when they don't, that would be less of a crime or get them less time. It doesn't really. I think threatening you have a weapon is the same as having one in most jurisdictions. But the tellers will act the same way. They won't ask to see the weapon or, treat it any differently just because the note says they have one or they say they have one and they don't. So I think they play off of that. They know that.
So I think most people, myself included, have a very kind of Hollywood vision of bank robberies in their head when we think about this. Are there important details of bank robberies that don't make it into the movies, or the movies consistently get wrong, or things people don't think about that you've seen in your career?
So one of the things that we always strive to do, and when I was in the FBI, of course, bank robbery is a federal violation, but most jurisdictions across the country, it's either worked in conjunction with the FBI or the local police worked the bank robbery themselves, especially after 9/11, when the FBI transitioned from doing a lot of criminal investigations to less criminal investigations and more national security related investigations. So many, many police departments do their own bank robbery investigations. But what we used to try and stress, and what we never did during a bank robbery investigation, was discuss how much money bank robbers were getting, because, you don't want to make it look profitable. And I'll say it can be profitable, but I don't know if it's as profitable as most bank robbers think it is. And so we always would just say, a significant amount of money, or we're looking for an amount of money. They got away with an amount of money, without saying exactly how much that was.
I know you don't want to publicize the exact take amounts. Is there you mentioned it's lower than people expect. Is there a public instance that you know of sort of what's the most in a career that a bank robber's ever taken away, from this kind of career? Is there a rough estimate?
Probably tens of thousands, but that would be over multiple robberies. Yeah. They could get tens of thousands over multiple robberies, but most of them, almost all of these get solved. We used to have I taught interview and interrogation for a while, and one of the techniques we used to teach was, in interviewing a bank robber or a robber, an armed robber, that the average life expectancy from the time they first do an armed robbery until they are either caught or dead is like less than 6 months. So this isn't a long-term career prospect. And very few bank robbers get away, forever. Very few.
You've shattered our illusion of, duffel bags with money signs on them, coming out of the vault. I wonder if we stick on this Hollywood image, right? You mentioned the careers are quite short. Does that mean that, getaway driver as a role is not, not a career path that's open for me at this point? Or is that such a thing, right? Do they have specialists and roles like you see in the movies, or is it not so much that way?
Yeah, they do, actually. There's not any training involved or anything, or any specialty. It's usually just like, all right, Joe, you're going to drive, we're going in. But yeah, they do have like getaway drivers. That happens when there are, multiple people involved, as opposed to most of them being the lone gunman. But when there are multiple ones, yeah, there's one guy out there waiting. And a lot of the scenarios you see on TV, the movies where, the cops roll up quickly, getaway driver will leave. They're not hanging around waiting for their buddies if they see the police show up, and that's happened, sure.
So I think all this talk of Hollywood, there's a question I have to ask. We've got FX Reagan on the show, the definitive expert on this. So settle this matter once and for all. What is the most accurate bank robbery movie out there?
So Heat probably is pretty good. and one thing, look, I said most of these guys get caught. So don't anybody take anything away from this, that I'm giving anybody any recommendations about what to do or how to do this. But armored car robberies can be a lot different than bank robberies. Those tend to be planned a lot more. They don't tend to get away with them because they get investigated and for the most part get solved. But they tend to be a little more complicated. There's a little more thinking. There's a lot more people involved. I think I posted about this in social media several times. I think I was involved in maybe 12 armored car robberies as an investigator, not as a robber. And every one of them was an inside job, one way or another. It was somebody that had a friend who used to work there. They used to work there. The friend still worked there. The friend was one of the drivers. The friend was on the loading dock when they're loading up the money. So, I mean, some of those do happen, and some of those involve a lot of money. Yeah, hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes. So those are sort of the ones, the armored car robberies are kind of the spin that you see in the movies on bank robberies, because those do happen like that.
That's really interesting. You mentioned that's a little bit more complex and there's more planning that goes into that. You know, I've heard stories, right? Stories, apocryphal stories that, you know, in prison, the population will treat the armed robbers as sort of more dangerous and sophisticated than your average murderer. Would you say from your experience, there's a certain type of criminal profile, a psychological profile that lends itself to being a bank robber?
Okay, well, aside from the one-offs we talk a lot about that are the majority of them who just need the money for drugs, yeah, certainly risk takers, people who are not, you know, well socialized to following the rules, that need the money quickly, that think that they're going to get away with it. I certainly agree with your premise that armed robbers in prison are probably viewed as more dangerous. Most murderers, at least here in the United States, most murders are somebody they know. It's the one and only time they're going to kill somebody. They're not serial killers. They're not out to kill more than one person. They're pissed off at somebody and kill them. So yeah, I think armed robbers generally are more dangerous than murderers.
So we're not talking about gentlemen thieves here. Are there linkages between other kinds of armed groups, you know, insurgents, terrorist networks, etc., and bank robberies? Is this something that is used as a tactic to fund armed movements?
I think there used to be more than there is today. I think going back to some of the early, you know, white nationalist groups in the late 70s, early 80s, maybe here in the United States, I think maybe even overseas, maybe even with the IRA. I can't point to a specific example, but I think that maybe used to be the case more than now. It's too dangerous now. I mean, if your ultimate goal is an act of terrorism and you need funds to do that, you need a more certain way. You can't risk getting caught. You can't risk getting caught quickly. You can't risk the people that get caught for the robbery giving up the terrorist plot. It's just way too complicated.
So you're mentioning kind of the international angle there with the IRA. You know, we're kind of speaking about the national level of investigation of bank robberies, but are there international bank robberies? Is that, you know, something you've seen, transnational bank robberies and investigations and things like that?
Okay, this will be since I've been out of the game, but there's a lot of aggressive robberies going on in the California area with Chilean gangs. A lot of them are burglaries, armed home burglaries. A lot of them are armed robberies at jewelry stores and things like that. I imagine some of them involved in banks. Again, I don't think there's any terrorist angle to them. I think they're just gangs. And I've heard and read that, you know, some of the MO is they'll come in here for a short period of time for the express purpose of acquiring a certain amount of cash, and then they go back to Chile with the money. So yeah, I think there are some, but I haven't seen a lot. I'm not aware of a lot in the United States of international armed bank robbers.
So in the modern world, one thing I'm really curious about is what's the role of technology in bank robberies? Are there, you know, in the movies we often see kind of the technical expert who cuts the alarm or redirects the call to a fake police line, you know, the safe crackers and so on. Do these kind of roles exist? Is there a use for this kind of technological expertise in a bank robbery?
You know, there's not a lot of it. I think most of the technology is old technology. Cameras. I mean, we used to joke back in, 30 years ago that it was one of the few crimes you could commit where you're guaranteed to get your picture taken. And that was when, there were kind of the dawn of where cameras everywhere. They were in banks before they were everywhere else. So there's always been cameras, or has been for a long time. There's always been silent alarms, has been for a long time. There's been die packs. That's true. The tellers will throw die packs, or the die packs will be part of the money that they take out of the till. It's not obvious. They take the money out of the till. There's a die pack in it. It goes into the pillowcase or the shopping bag or whatever the armed robber's using. And when they hit the door, not a state secret, there's a triggering mechanism on the door that sets off the die pack for a certain period of time, 20 seconds. So when it goes through the door, trips that alarm to the die pack inside, the bag that the robber's carrying. And then, 30 seconds, a minute later, the die pack goes off. But this is not new technology. It's been going on for years. But in terms of the much more sophisticated, like you're talking about with bypassing alarms, coming in the roof, things like that at nighttime, that happens. There are bank burglaries, but I think the vaults make it much harder to do that than say, a grocery store or, a drugstore, somebody else that has cash on the premises and maybe a crude safe that can be cut into. A bank vault is pretty serious. You're talking a real specialty if somebody were able to break into a vault.
So having robbed a bank, how do these robbers dispose of this cash? We've had Yahya Fanuzi on a previous season. He discussed sort of money laundering with us. But are there any kind of short-term tricks used by these bank robbers to try and launder or fence this money?
Well, having said most of it's drug-related, I'd say that it would go that way. It would just be involved in, purchasing drugs or buying larger amounts of drugs from your supplier. I can't say specifically, but I know that, in one major metropolitan city, I was an FBI agent in for a long time. There were a lot of like car washes, and we used to call them party stores. They're really just stores that sell alcohol, small amounts of groceries, cigarettes, lottery tickets, things like that. A lot of cash business, good place to launder money. So yeah, any way to get a lot of them owe money. So whatever they're getting, they owe it to somebody, whether it's, a drug dealer that they're in hawk for or something like that. So again, I'll go back to the fact that most of them are not that sophisticated. So the amount of money that they get quickly gets spent.
Well, we've been speaking to FX Reagan about how to rob a bank. After the break, we'll be talking about how banks and other law enforcement agencies counter this threat.
You have been listening to How to Get on a Watchlist, the podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. If you like this show, don't forget to check out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica, which you can find at howtogetonawatchlist.com, where you can find our analysis on various geopolitical issues, as well as reading lists covering topics like those discussed in the podcast. Please also consider subscribing to the podcast on your streaming platform of choice, giving us a rating, and joining our Patreon.
So we've been talking to FX Reagan about how to rob a bank, and now let's talk a little bit about how banks protect themselves. So FX, how do banks deter robberies? How do they protect themselves?
I think it first starts with training. Most banks have a pretty robust training regime for all of the employees, tellers. The most important thing is to stay safe, not to confront a bank robber, not to do anything that, would spook them or cause them to shoot somebody or take hostages or something like that. Most of them work very closely with the police and with the FBI to facilitate this training. Back in the day, there used to be a lot of task forces. In fact, one of the very first FBI task forces was a bank robbery task force in New York with the NYPD. So I think that's the main thing, is training with employees. Of course, I spoke earlier about the vaults. That's a time-honored tradition or a way of protecting money. Nobody can open a vault once it's closed. There's only a certain amount of money there. There's only a certain amount of money in the tills. I think those are kind of the general ways that they protect themselves.
Going off of this, acknowledging that banks themselves are now fairly hardened targets. You mentioned in the first half that the armored cars, the transport of the money is a particular weak point where there's potential for greater take. Are there other locations, at the top of your mind that are at heightened risk for targeting by these kinds of robbers? And then how are these locations, better able to make themselves harder target?
So jewelry stores for sure, especially high-end jewelry stores, they are at risk. because there's so much valuable merchandise there. Many of them do the same thing that banks do. They have pretty sophisticated alarm systems, pretty sophisticated cameras, the alarms that go to a monitoring station. They're pretty good about putting things away, not leaving any jewelry out after a certain period of time. Many of them, we didn't talk about this with banks, but it applies to banks and to a lot of jewelry stores and to other businesses that have valuable merchandise, and that's armed guards or off-duty police. That can be dangerous. It can be a dangerous job, but it also can be a real deterrent. Even an armed robber with a will, if you had your choice between a bank or a jewelry store that had an armed, uniformed officer or a guard there and one that didn't, you clearly go to the one that didn't. And many banks will have lines of banks at one company. It's their policy to have, a uniformed armed guard in that bank all the time.
So staying on this theme of policies there, are banks required to meet kind of minimum security standards? Are there any laws that say, if you're a bank, you have to have X, Y, Z in place, or is it really up to the banks?
I think the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures banks, has a certain standard that they have to have of security in place, including training, in order to be an FDIC bank, and nobody would be an FDIC. There are no FDIC banks that I'm aware of. For the most part, there are probably some small private banks that aren't FDIC insured. But yeah, I think the answer to that is yes.
So since we're on this topic of insurance and what's required, to meet that standard, you're talking a lot about the training and the security procedures that are in place, being insured against these robberies. What sort of role does the insurance side of this play in how the banks design their response procedures? Is the money basically considered a total write-off as part of those procedures, or how does that relationship work between the insurers and the banks?
I think for the most part, it's probably just a total write-off. If it's a significant amount of money, then that's different. Then then the FDIC, I think, would come in and make those losses to the bank whole, because they pay to be an FDIC. It's like any other insurance, right? You pay for it. But I'm sure that the deductibles, if that's what they even call it in that industry, are probably pretty high. A couple $1,000 loss, the bank just eats it. But start to sneak up and lose significant amount of money in an armed robbery, and even an armored car robbery. There are several armored car robberies that have never been solved, big ones in the hundreds of thousands. That I'm sure that the FDIC had to pay off on that. Yeah.
So you talked in the first half of the show about the insider risk, right? The inside job kind of angle on these robberies. In season 2, we've talked about insider risks with Dr. Maria Robson-Monroe and Holden Triplett, and they're focusing on that, especially from sort of an espionage side. But how can banks specifically work against that kind of threat? Because it's not an area I see the insider threat community talk quite a bit about, this specific kind of insider.
Yeah, so you always start with background checks, background investigations. Typically your lower level employees in banks are not highly paid. You're not getting a highly skilled worker, highly educated. But you can do the minimal amount, like a background check, including a police check, to see if they have a prior record that would show you that they have a problem that might manifest itself by being around a lot of money, like a theft problem, a drug problem. Oftentimes, as I think I mentioned, the insider is, the girlfriend of the robber. And I've even seen it where they're more than one, many times. They're the unwilling insider. The boyfriend just decides that he needs cash, and she's going to be the conduit to get that cash, and he basically forces her to do it. So, yeah, to the extent that they can do a good job of screening employees before they get them, that's probably the best deterrence. Making sure that if an employee who was an otherwise good employee that didn't have a record starts to have a problem with attendance, showing up intoxicated or high, there's little indicators that person has a personal problem. That might be somewhere to go with, moving that employee out so that they don't become a problem, don't become the inside threat. I think those are the things that they probably have in place to try and minimize that risk.
So what about bystanders then? If you're a random customer queuing up at the bank one day and you find yourself in the middle of a robbery, I'm assuming playing the hero to try and save the bank's money is probably not the best course of action. But what should a bystander do? What's your advice for anyone who finds themselves in a situation like this?
Here's what I tell people. I'm still authorized to carry my firearm 24/7 under, we call it HR 218. I think the name of the law has changed, but retired law enforcement officers who receive training every year are authorized in all 50 states in the United States to carry a firearm. If I were in a bank with my firearm or anywhere, grocery store, drugstore, and a robbery were going down, I'd want to be the best witness possible. Period. Go to cover, get out of the way, don't try and do anything. That's my advice to people who are standing there and don't have a firearm or have never been trained, don't know anything about robberies. You just want to be as invisible as possible. You want to be away from the person with the gun as quickly as you can, safely. Yeah, absolutely don't do anything. Now, the good news is most people don't go to banks much anymore. I mean, everything is on your phone or drive-through. There's really not a lot of reason to go into bank. Sometimes you have to sign papers. Sometimes you're opening an account. Sometimes you're getting a loan, so you have to be in the bank. But, for the most part, you don't see lines of people in the bank like you used to in the old days where, 10, 20 people standing in line in a lobby. It doesn't happen a lot. But again, you want to be the best witness possible.
So to that point, you mentioned before that the money is insured anyway, right? It's not worth, losing your life over. What happens to that money though that goes out the door? Is it invalidated at any point? Does the bank know, okay, which serial numbers of money we had that went out the door? There's die packs that you mentioned before, or can anybody just kind of scoop these bags up and spend them, willy-nilly?
Yeah, so a combination of all three. There's a lot of money that's not traceable. There's money that has the die pack explosion on it and hopefully on the robber. I mean, we've caught the old caught red-handed. That's where that phrase comes from. You've been caught red-handed because the red die pack blew up. I think a lot of them are blue now or purple, if I remember correctly. But yeah, when I was working bank robberies, on a squad, a violent crime squad in a big city, we caught a lot of bank robbers with the die all over them, their clothes, inside the car. I mean, it was great. And I guess that still happens. So yeah, there's that. There's the die on the money. And then there are serial numbers that are captured. So in those tills will have, pre-staged money that the serial numbers are captured. And so we can write down and have the serial numbers and kind of follow it backwards. And many a robber has been caught, spending cash that has a serial number recorded.
So just coming back to the Hollywood depictions, I'm thinking about the movie The Town, about Charlestown, Massachusetts, which really claimed that was kind of an epicenter of a spate of bank robberies. Are there national hotspots like this? And thinking particularly about the law enforcement response, are there special task forces stood up to address these kind of hotspots? How does that dynamic work?
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes. Los Angeles used to be the real hotspot. I think at one time in I'll say the middle 2000s, early 2005, 6, 7, something like that. I mean, they were having 30, 40, 50 bank robberies a day. I mean, it was crazy. And there was a famous shootout that took place in Los Angeles. I cannot remember the time frame. I want to say late 90s. Google it'll come right up. And there's a lot of video of it. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of rounds fired between the police and the bank robbers. So yeah, there are hotspots, mostly big cities. You can think of them, the big ones: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., where they have spates of bank robberies like that are very violent, that happen a lot. And there are certainly task forces between the local police, different federal agencies, if it's a state, the state police, neighboring jurisdictions, because that's, that happens a lot where the major a major city suburb has 5 or 6 major suburbs, and the bank robbers don't care about jurisdictional lines. They'll rob in one county one day and next county the next day, and so the police have to coordinate that and make sure they're all working the same target. One of the things we used to do, it still happens, I'm sure, is and I have in my notes on how not to rob a bank. You never want to be the target of an FBI investigation where there's a nickname for the robber, because that means you've arrived at the big time. And that's one of the things we used to do is, we had the the bag man robber because they put a bag over their head, or the left-handed robber because they apparently had a gun in their left hand, so appeared left-handed, or the pigeon-toed bank robber or something like that. If you acquire a nickname, you're going to get caught. Let me tell you.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like insurgents and CTE missions and so on. As soon as the insurgent gets a name, their days are numbered. And I believe a moment ago you were talking about the Battle of North Hollywood. Is that the particular one? That was 1997. And if I've got the story right, it was where two heavily armored robbers ended up with a shootout in LA with the police. So sounds like something really out of Heat or a similar movie.
There's this long-standing myth that in the Roaring Twenties, especially, the bank robbers, Bonnie and Clyde, were better armed than the G-men that were trying to catch them, run them down. Is that a real concern for police forces, especially now at the municipal level?
I talked about the Miami shootout in 1986 earlier, and that was definitely the case there. The FBI agents were armed with revolvers for the most part. There were a couple of SWAT agents that had the first iterations of semi-automatic handguns that agents were carrying. They weren't a great gun. And they had shotguns, but no long guns, like they have today. That case, that 1986, literally put the FBI on a war footing to upgrade their sidearm, and resulted in going from a .357 Magnum revolver initially to a 10 millimeter Smith & Wesson, which at the time was a gun that was developed around the bullet. The FBI came up with what they thought was the perfect round, which is a 10 millimeter. They thought roughly equivalent to a 40 millimeter today. And they designed that weapon around that gun. It was heavy. Had a heavy kick. It was hard for a lot of people to qualify with it. And eventually the FBI went to a 9 millimeter SIG, 226 and 228. That was the direct result of that. I mean, there was great angst and discussion and research and so many things that went on as a result of that one incident. Today, I'd say the average police response, the average cruiser for almost every, if not most, or most, if not every police department, they're probably better armed than the bank robbers. Not that you can't be. I mean, if you're a bank robber and you really want to be armed, you can go get as many guns or as many weapons as you and your gang can acquire. But for the most part, the police are pretty well armed.
So just coming back to the banks, I'm thinking about kind of countermeasures. Are there any modern countermeasures in banks that we don't see in the movies? So you talked about die packs, for example. Are there any other kind of clever bits of tech that exist to help protect banks against this sort of attack?
I don't think so. The favorite that people go to is facial recognition software, which used to really not be anything, but AI is making it more of a thing. I'm a bit out of the game on that when it relates to banks, but I got to believe that it'd be something they have an interest in, especially for known robbers, because, I talk about the task forces and the nicknames and the training. And, there is quite a robust share of information. So if there's, a robber going around town hitting different branches of, different named banks, they're all going to keep track of it. And, the security directors of these banks all know each other. Most of them are former law enforcement from the area jurisdictions or from the federal agencies. So they'll keep on top of that. But in terms of really high-end technology, I'm not really aware of any. It's, it's a dynamic crime, which is going to walk in the door unexpectedly. And, again, other than being prepared for it and having the bank robber get as little amount of money out the door safely, which is, ultimately the goal.
You mentioned that a lot of these security directors of these banks are, themselves former law enforcement. They're in these networks of other security directors of other banks. What's the intelligence sharing look like there, between the banks and law enforcement, about the environment, about the kinds of threats, about the tactics? Is that a strong relationship that's ongoing?
Yeah, I think at several levels. I mean, they have, informal get-togethers every Friday at the coffee shop to, conferences at the local, regional, and national level. They're dialed into, major security organizations with their own subgroups. So yeah, I think it's a very robust sharing of information. Yeah.
You mentioned also, that the AI technologies that are coming out that are changing how people do security, physical security. Is there any kind of tech that you're aware of on the law enforcement side that the police departments or the FBI have that they can bring to bear in kind of creative ways to prevent bank robberies, to track them when they happen? Is there anything we haven't seen in the films, right, that's a new tool?
It's not necessarily new, but it's really become effective, and that's license plates readers. Jurisdictions that are their apprehension rate for criminals across the board, whether it's armed robbers, murderers traveling different jurisdictions, drug dealers, stolen cars. You pick a crime that involves moving in a car. The license plate readers are set up around town or around a county or a jurisdiction. The ability of those license plate readers to capture, tens of thousands of license plates at a day and quickly identify the one and get the message to the police that it just went through, 21st and Main Street, and have the police respond and get that vehicle is amazing and happening at a really rapid pace across the country for the places that have those.
So what about after a successful robbery? Let's say the robbers have gotten away. How do banks and law enforcement agencies work to recover the funds and catch the perpetrators? And in particular, I'm really interested in, what does an investigation around this type of crime look like? How long does it take, and how likely are they to be successful?
I think they can be fairly quickly solved for the most part. But some of them can drag out, especially as we talked about the serial bank robber or somebody that's acquired a nickname because they're doing so many of them. Those can go on for weeks, months. I don't think many go much more than, a couple of months, even the most sophisticated. But it starts out with commonalities. Okay, is this, the guy that just robbed the bank at 21st and Maple, is that the same one that hit yesterday over in Springfield? Is that the same one that hit, in Chicago? So trying to tie together the bank robberies to see if this is part of the same person or persons that are doing it, so you can sort of narrow that focus down and have either you or, the police or the investigators that are on that particular group of robbers working that angle. Certainly informants help out, people in the neighborhood who know what's going on. Every police officer, FBI agent, federal agent has groups of informants that they can call on and say, hey, who knows what about the bank robbery at 21st and Maple yesterday? Somebody knows something. Reward money, that's out there, either from the police or the FBI, or most jurisdictions now have Crime Stoppers where they anonymously pay for tips. And, it gets out to Crime Stoppers. There's a pretty good chance that somebody's going to call the tip line at 2:00 in the morning and tell the police exactly who did it. And, they're successful in getting, a couple $100 or whatever the reward for that is. That's one way of doing it. Fingerprints have solved a lot of banks, a lot of bank robberies. Photographs, because a lot of these people are getting their picture taken. So, you can put a mask on, but a lot of them don't, surprisingly. So they get their picture taken, and now this guy shows up on, 3 different bank robberies. Again, you have informants out there, or you go through driver license pictures and boom, there he is. So there's all kinds of ways to, work that investigation and find out who did it. You initially asked about the money. Unless it's a big robbery and you catch them quickly, there's not a lot of money recovered most of the time. Seems to get spent quickly. And again, I keep going back, it's not a lot of money for the most part.
So you mentioned before that after 9/11, the FBI kind of downsized the role it played in investigating a lot of these local bank robberies in particular. Is this still something that your average investigator at a field office is going to have a lot of training on? Is it a core competency that everybody gets the training, at Quantico on? And how's it regarded, within a career? Or is this something where you're going to tell a lot of stories and it's well regarded that, you worked the big bank robbery case? Or is it, it's more like routine police work?
In the FBI, when I was there, before 9/11 and after 9/11, it's really almost two different organizations. Before 9/11, agents that worked criminal, which was 80% of the agents worked criminal matters, 20% worked counterintelligence or counterterrorism matters. And so the agents that worked criminal matters tended to work what they wanted to work. They just kind of got drawn to white collar crime. They got drawn to violent crime. They got drawn to public corruption. They got drawn to undercover work. And then just kind of, it was a niche. And so you just kind of worked it. And, you could put in for whatever you wanted. If you were on a drug squad and you really wanted to work violent crime, you just go ask the boss, hey, next time there's an opening on the violent crime squad, I want to go over there. and you get over there. But yeah, I think it was looked at the time as, sort of if you were a former cop like I was and you're drawn to doing real police work, bank robberies, fugitives, stolen cars, heists, things like that were, kind of more in your wheelhouse than public corruption or, white collar crime. So I think agents really liked working it. I think they probably still do. And there's some of it that still goes on. It's not a priority, but if there were, to pop up in a major city, a major armed robbery gang that seemed pretty sophisticated and that the FBI could lend resources in or to, I'm sure they'd be right in. I'm sure they are. So it's something that still gets worked. It's just not as big a priority as it used to be because, again, most police departments, their robbery divisions, their homicide robbery units, pretty confident they don't need the FBI to help. They'll take the FBI's help, but they don't, for the most part, need the help.
So coming off of the back of that, do you have any advice for anybody that's considering a career in law enforcement that's similar to your career, kind of moving around, touching on this subject and other subjects? What's your best advice for those up and comers?
Well, I hope people do, because the news about how hard it is for police departments to recruit right now is certainly highly accurate. I'm on a lot of forums with former police, former FBI agents, and it's amazing that 30 years ago, generally, it was pretty competitive to get hired as a police officer. I mean, written tests, and they still have all these things, don't get me wrong. But, you'd have a certain number of applicants going into the written test, the oral board interview, the polygraph, the physical, both the medical part and the physical training part, the PT test. And, there was quite a weeding down of applicants between the time people put in and the time they went to the academy. Today, it's not a job that a lot of people aspire to. And I mean, some of it is just the demeaning of the police in the last couple of years. Unfortunately, there's a lot of second guessing that goes on. There's a lot of police officers that are afraid to do their job because they see, you're one bad shooting away from, going to prison. Now, that's where the training and the, being smart and hopefully having good decision and judgment comes in, that doesn't happen. But, things happen fast. And, there are police officers out there doing the right thing. And maybe they're in the wrong jurisdiction and a shooting or something they get involved in one city or state. Nothing would happen to them. And, 500 miles away, they're looking at prison time. So I hope people can consider that job. I hope they can go into it with their eyes wide open, that, it can be a dangerous job, but it can be a really rewarding career to serve your community and your country. And I hope people do.
One question, we've talked a lot about the kind of the history of how bank robberies have happened and so on, and how you've seen that evolve over your career. Looking to the future, what do you think bank robberies are going to look like in the coming years? And one thing in particular I'm thinking here is, we're moving towards a cashless society. I can't think of the last time I carried cash. What happens, what do these crimes look like in that kind of world? Do the commodities being targeted change? Do the targets change?
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, I mean, just in the community I live in, there's no big banks. There are big bank companies, JP Morgan Chase, but they're just very small branches that, again, I was saying earlier, nobody ever goes to. I mean, maybe they go to the drive-through. And I think that's a function of what you're talking about. There's just that cash is not really a thing. I'm with you. I can have $20 in my wallet for a month. So, yeah, I think the crimes do change. I think the people who are drawn toward violent crime that don't have the sophistication to do, something that involving credit cards or checks or crypto or, any other kind of white collar crime, they're always going to be drawn toward a violent crime. That may manifest itself in street robberies, carjackings. Just in Washington, D.C., they've had like 900 carjackings this year. Again, mostly young, 18, 19, 17 years old. Some of it's joyriding, but some of it's just for the money real quick. Get a car, strip it, sell the parts, buy drugs. So, violent criminals are always going to find a way to be violent robbery criminals to rob something, whether it's, grocery stores don't have a lot of cash. But gas stations, party stores, nail salons, places like that. Yeah, I think you're always going to have that.
A final question from us that we ask everyone: what keeps you up at night? And on this topic specifically, the bank robberies and the violent crime.
I think from a violent crime perspective, I think that it's kind of a loss of respect for life that, especially young criminals, I don't think they realize how quickly it can all end and how dangerous it is what they're involved in, not just for them, but for, the people and the institutions, the places they're going in to rob, how quickly things can go wrong. And that, most of those sort of shootings or, assaults that take place where people are really hurt, I don't think that they realize how fast that happens and how violent it is. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's a function of society where we just care less about it, whether it has anything to do with video games or music or culture. I don't know. But I do worry about that. I do worry about the fact that violence is desensitized. And you can't go on social media and scroll for a half hour without seeing somebody get killed, literally. So just, you're not even looking for it, but there's a video of, somebody running from the police and getting shot in the head. I mean, how many times can you watch that and it not have an effect on you? So I worry about the violent culture more than any one specific event. And I hope we figure it out and then we become a less violent culture.
Well, FX Reagan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been really good.
Well, you've been listening to How to Rob a Bank with FX Reagan. FX's extensive collection of books will all be linked in the show notes, and you can follow all of his work at fxreagan.com. We encourage our listeners to check out the books and the website. Our producer for this show was Edwin Tran, our researcher was Alex Smith, and to all our listeners and Patreon supporters, thank you so much for supporting How to Get on a Watchlist.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider checking out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica. We'd also appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, or support us on Patreon. Thanks for listening.
What's your emergency?